There is a particular kind of silence that only exists in the mountains before a snowstorm. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something heavy. A weight in the air that presses against your ears and makes every creak of pine wood feel deliberate, as though the forest itself is holding its breath. People who grew up in the hollows and ridges of Appalachia knew that silence the way they knew their own heartbeat. It was a warning. It was a clock, and it meant that whatever had not yet been done, whatever food had not been put up, whatever wood had not been split, whatever hide had not been stretched or seed had not been stored, was already too late. The Appalachian Mountains stretch roughly about 500 miles from northern Alabama through Georgia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky, and into Pennsylvania and beyond. For most of American history, the people who lived in the deep hollows where roads didn't reach lived in a state of near total self-sufficiency, not because it was a philosophy they chose, but because there was simply no other option. The nearest town could be 12 miles of mountain walking away. A winter that came early, or a summer that stayed too dry, was not an inconvenience. It was a crisis that could hollow out a family by spring. What those families built over generations was not simply a collection of skills. It was a complete and integrated system of living. A way of reading the world around them and responding to it with precision honed through hard experience and bitter loss. This is the story of 25 of those skills. The first and most foundational was the reading of weather through direct observation. Appalachian families understood that a halo around the moon almost always meant rain or snow within 24 hours. When cattle gathered close and turned their backs to the wind, a storm was hours away. When certain hardwood leaves flipped upward in response to falling barometric pressure, the sky would open by afternoon. They watched the sequence of wildflower blooms, noted when katydids went silent, and tracked animal movements across the ridges. This phenological literacy was the difference between being caught in the high ridges with an empty wagon and being home before the first flake fell. The second skill was the preservation of food through salt. Before refrigeration, salt was among the most precious commodities in mountain life. Dry salting pork required working at the right temperature, between 36 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold enough to slow bacterial growth, but warm enough to let salt penetrate before spoilage began. Families judged the right amount of salt by feel, not by measurement. The results of that judgment fed households through February and March, when the root cellar had grown thin and the ground was still locked solid. The third was the mastery of the smokehouse. Smoking meat was survival chemistry before anyone called it that. The phenol compounds in smoke from burning hickory, apple, or oak inhibit bacterial and mold growth, extending the shelf life of meat dramatically. Mountain families knew that green wood produced too much moisture and could sour a ham. They knew that resinous pine left deposits that made people ill. The knowledge of which woods to burn and how long to smoke different cuts, ham requiring days, venison requiring constant attention, was passed through direct apprenticeship, not written recipes. The fourth was the root cellar, one of the most elegant technologies in Appalachian mountain life. Built into a hillside or dug 8 to 10 feet below the frost line, it exploited the stable temperature of the earth to create a natural refrigerator, requiring no energy and no machinery. The ground at that depth holds between 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, cold enough to slow decomposition without freezing. Potatoes, turnips, onions, cabbages, and apples could last for months. Some families stored winter squash well past the new year. The difference between a well-stocked root cellar in November and an empty one was the difference between a hard winter and a genuinely dangerous one. The fifth skill was ash lye soap making, folk science at its most precise. Families poured rainwater through saved hardwood ash to leach potassium hydroxide from it. The concentration of the resulting lye was tested by floating a fresh egg. If a surface area roughly the size of a silver dollar appeared above the liquid, the lye was correct. Too strong and it burned the skin. Too weak and the soap wouldn't set. The lye was combined with rendered lard and cooked over a fire until the mixture would harden upon cooling. This soap treated infections, cleaned wounds, and washed clothing. A single product that served functions now requiring an entire shelf of specialized items. The sixth was seed saving. Mountain families selected each autumn from their most productive plants and preserved those seeds for the following year. Over generations, this produced varieties exquisitely adapted to specific hollows. Bean varieties that germinated reliably in short, high-altitude seasons. Corn strains that resisted the fungal pressures of particular valleys. Many of these varieties were entirely unique to single communities. Heritage varieties like Bloody Butcher corn and dozens of Appalachian pole beans still preserved by seed libraries today exist only because people understood that saving seed was as essential as salting meat. The seventh skill was the spring house, perhaps the most elegant piece of vernacular architecture in Appalachian life. Built directly over or beside a natural spring, it used the constant flow of cold water to keep dairy products and eggs cool through summer. The flowing water held temperatures in the low to mid-40s Fahrenheit, cold enough to keep butter solid and milk fresh for several days. The sound of the spring running through the floor on a hot July afternoon was one of the most welcome sounds a mountain family could hear. It meant the milk hadn't turned. It meant there would be butter for the cornbread. It meant one more day of normalcy preserved. The eighth skill was the preparation and use of medicinal herbs. Willow bark tea relieved pain and fever because it contained salicylic acid, a chemical precursor to aspirin, a fact mountain families knew through practice long before science named it. Slippery elm bark soothed inflamed mucous membranes in throats and bowels. Elderflower tea broke fevers through genuine diaphoretic properties now documented by pharmacologists. Boneset, named for its reputation easing the deep bone ache of influenza, contains compounds that do in fact stimulate immune response. The woman who maintained this knowledge, often called the granny woman, occupied a position of enormous importance. When she died without a successor, something genuinely irreplaceable was lost. The ninth was the hot water bath canning of food, a technology that transformed Appalachian food security after reliable glass jars became available in the late 19th century. Families learned, sometimes through fatal experience, which foods could be safely water-bathed and which required a pressure canner. Acidic foods like tomatoes, pickles, and apple butter could be water-bathed because their acidity inhibited Clostridium botulinum, the organism responsible for botulism. Low-acid foods like green beans and corn absolutely required pressure canning. Only temperatures around 240 degrees Fahrenheit could destroy that bacterium's heat-resistant spores. Families that learned this correctly could fill a pantry with 100 quarts in a single autumn week and face the winter with a quiet confidence no amount of money could replicate. The 10th was the weaving of white oak baskets, a craft refined over centuries in Appalachia, drawing on both European wicker traditions and the basket-making knowledge of Cherokee communities who had inhabited those mountains for thousands of years before European settlement arrived. White oak baskets were light, strong, breathable, and could be made in any size. Small gathering baskets for berries, large storage baskets for dried beans, heavy egg baskets that withstood daily use for years. The wood had to be freshly cut and green. Dried oak splits too crudely to weave. Some of the oldest surviving examples in museum collections are more than a century old and structurally sound. The 11th skill was the care of cast iron cookware. A Dutch oven or skillet was a significant financial investment expected to last not just a lifetime, but several generations. The key was the seasoning. A layer of polymerized fat baked into the porous iron that protected against rust and created a cooking surface that improved with each use. Mountain cooks knew never to use soap on cast iron, never to let it sit wet, never to heat it dry over too hot a fire. A well-seasoned pan, dark as a mountain night and smooth as river stone, was a family treasure. The beans and cornbread and venison stew that passed through those skillets fed households through winter after winter, and the pans outlasted the houses they were cooked in. The 12th was the knowledge of wild edibles. In the dangerous weeks between when the root cellar grew sparse and the garden produced anything, wild greens were often the only fresh food available. Ramps, the wild leek growing in dense colonies along mountain stream banks, emerged early enough to provide vitamin C and iron at precisely the moment when winter-fed bodies needed them most. Poke salad, the young shoots of pokeweed cooked correctly, offered another burst of spring nutrition. Wild watercress, wood sorrel, and violets extended the early season table for families who knew what they were looking for. This knowledge wasn't optional. In lean years, it was the difference between a family that thrived into April and one that didn't. The 13th skill was the construction of the pole barn, a roof on posts, open to the sides, that provided shelter for livestock without the enormous material investment of a fully enclosed building. Mountain farmers learned to site their pole barns so the prevailing winter wind struck a solid back wall, leaving the interior calm. Hay stored in the loft above insulated the space further. Livestock that died through a hard winter meant not just lost food and labor, but the potential collapse of the entire farm system. The same animals that provided meat and dairy also pulled the plow and fertilized the following year's crops. The 14th was the banking of fire through winter nights. A fire that went out when temperatures dropped below zero meant a long, cold morning of restarting with potentially wet wood. A fire banked too intensely could set the chimney ablaze. Families learned to cover coals with a thick layer of ash that held heat through 6 or 8 hours of sleep without extinguishing or flaring dangerously. They knew that oak, hickory, and locust held coals far longer than pine or poplar, and stacked their evening fires accordingly. Walking downstairs to a living coal on a January morning was not a small comfort. The 15th skill was the making of hominy through nixtamalization, cooking dried corn in a lye solution made from wood ash. This process, practiced by indigenous communities for millennia and integrated into Appalachian culture through sustained contact, breaks down niacin-binding compounds in corn and releases nutrients the human body cannot access from untreated grain. Populations eating unnixtamalized corn as a staple were vulnerable to pellagra, a niacin deficiency causing severe skin lesions, dementia, and death. Appalachian families who made lye hominy grits were protected from this disease without understanding the biochemistry behind their protection. The ash lye did the work. The tradition preserved the knowledge. The 16th was the tanning of animal hides using the inner bark of chestnut, oak, and hemlock trees. Hides soaked in progressively stronger tannin solutions over weeks were transformed into leather for boots, harnesses, and gloves. Before the American chestnut blight, which began sweeping through Appalachian forests after 1904 and eventually killed an estimated 4 billion trees, chestnut bark was the premier tanning material in the region. The loss of that tree was not only an ecological catastrophe, it was a direct blow to the material culture of communities that had relied on the American chestnut for tannin, lumber, split rails, and food for generations. The 17th was split rail fencing. Unlike board fences or stone walls, the worm fence required no posts driven into the ground, no nails, no hardware of any kind. Rails split from straight-grained wood using wedges and a froe were stacked in an interlocking zigzag pattern that was entirely self-supporting. A well-built worm fence lasted 20 years or more and could be dismantled and rebuilt entirely if a field needed to change shape. When the chestnut blight destroyed the preferred fencing wood, mountain farmers adapted to white oak and red cedar and moved forward without ceremony. The 18th was the preservation of eggs through water glass, a sodium silicate solution that sealed the porous shell surface and extended storage life from weeks to months. Families collected eggs intensively during peak spring and summer laying, then stored them in crocks in a cool cellar. An egg stored in June could be safely eaten in November. Families that practiced this technique had reliable access to protein through the deep winter months when hens laid little and other sources of protein were scarce or unpredictable. The 19th was the bee gum hive, a section of hollow black gum tree sealed at both ends, used to house honeybees. Black gum was chosen because its twisted grain makes it nearly impossible to split. preventing cracking under outdoor stress. The bees provided honey used both as a sweetener and as a wound dressing. Its high sugar content and natural hydrogen peroxide production create an environment hostile to bacterial growth. Mountain families knew from observation that honey poured over an infected cut inhibited bacteria and promoted healing in situations that might otherwise have turned fatal. Beeswax provided material for candles, waterproofing leather, and sealing preserving jars. The 20th was the making of sorghum molasses. Sorghum cane grew reliably in Appalachian conditions where sugarcane could not, and its pressed juice boiled down into an iron-rich molasses that provided calories and minerals a diet of stored vegetables and salted meat frequently lacked. The pressed juice was boiled in long, shallow evaporating pans, requiring constant skimming and careful temperature judgment. Undercooked sorghum soured. Overcooked sorghum crystallized. The autumn sorghum pressing was often a community gathering, one of the social events that knit mountain families together across the hard months of winter preparation. The 21st was candle making and the management of light. Appalachian families rendered tallow from beef or mutton fat and poured it around twisted cotton wicks to produce candles adequate for evening work. Beeswax candles burned brighter and were reserved for special occasions or traded for other goods. In the week surrounding the winter solstice, when night arrived at 4 in the afternoon and held until 7 the next morning, the ability to maintain steady light, to sew, to carve, to sit together as a family, was as much about psychological survival as physical survival. The 22nd was the reading of mountain waterways. Mountain farmers and hunters learned to assess a stream's color and turbidity in ways that revealed upstream conditions. A sudden rise and change to yellow-brown meant rain in the headwaters hours before it reached the hollow below. The distribution of gravel bars and pools told experienced eyes where fish would hold at different temperatures. The presence of certain aquatic insects indicated water quality and the health of upstream forest cover. This knowledge guided fishing, safe river crossing, and the prediction of flood conditions days before they fully arrived. The 23rd was the basic hand forging and repair of iron tools. Farm life depended on iron. In axe heads, hoe blades, plow points, horseshoes and chains, and the ability to repair that iron locally was enormously valuable. Many mountain men knew how to build a small forge from local stone, produce charcoal hot enough for metalwork, and use a hammer and anvil to reshape a worn or broken tool. The ringing of an anvil in a mountain hollow was the sound of self-sufficiency being maintained one repair at a time. The 24th was the living phenological calendar, timing planting not by a printed almanac, but by reading the behavior of living things. They planted beans when the dogwood bloomed. They planted corn when oak leaves reached the size of a squirrel's ear, a marker tied to real soil temperature thresholds. They tracked whether serviceberry flowered before or after a late frost and calibrated the following year's planting accordingly. The living world around them was more accurate than any page because the living world responded to the same soil temperatures and moisture conditions that the crops would face. The 25th, and perhaps the most quietly profound of all, was the institution of community labor exchange, the barn raising, the harvest gathering, the corn husking. No single mountain household could do everything alone, and the solution was a mutual exchange in which labor was the currency and trust was the contract. A family that helped their neighbor raise a barn in October could count on that neighbor when their own need came around. No money changed hands. The social fabric itself was the agreement. Communities that maintained that fabric survived. Those that lost it were genuinely vulnerable in ways no amount of individual skill could compensate for. What these 25 skills represent is something larger than any survival curriculum. They describe a complete ecology of human life, one in which nothing was wasted, nothing was taken for granted, and every person in a community carried knowledge that someone else depended on. These were not simple people. They were extraordinarily competent people operating with tremendous intelligence within the constraints of their environment. They read the mountains like a language. They understood chemistry through practice. biology through observation, and engineering through necessity. Most of that knowledge is gone now. Electricity arrived in most Appalachian communities between the 1930s and 1950s, and with it came refrigeration and factory-produced goods, and the slow dissolution of the systems that had made self-sufficiency both possible and necessary. Knowledge that took 200 years to accumulate became unnecessary within a generation and forgotten within two, standing now in what remains of those communities, where old smokehouses lean against collapsing spring houses, where stone root cellar foundations outlast the houses that once stood above them. It is difficult not to feel the weight of what passed through here. Not just the hardship, the competence, the particular calm that comes from understanding exactly what you need and exactly how to get it from the world around you. The mountains are still here. The streams still run cold and clear through the same hollows. The serviceberry still blooms white against the gray April sky like a memory that refuses to fade. Everything these mountains once gave, they are still offering. They are only waiting for someone who still knows how to receive it.